Hello, welcome to Metahumanism podcast, where we investigate the contemporary world at the intersection of three philosophical perspectives: metahumanism, metamodernism, and decolonialism, with a Ukrainian accent. So in the last episode, I introduced the overall framework of thinking about war and discussed a number of different perspectives on war. And I suggested that I would continue in this episode by examining war in terms of culture. And that's what I intend to do. But more specifically, I want to focus on two themes: peace and justice, as they relate to cultural understanding of war, and some other aspects as well. And with this episode, what I will conclude the series on the philosophies of war and also finish the first season of the podcast. I have a great need to step back, take a break, and reassess, reevaluate what's been my journey so far, so what's been achieved on this channel, and also just take care of my mental health needs. Everybody who should always take care of, should engage in self-care. It's very important for everybody. So this is a great need that I have right now, and I think this is the time to do it. I can firmly say that the journey will continue, and in the next season, I will pick up some of the philosophical threads or open directions and open ends that I left throughout the past 25 episodes so far. I will continue focusing on Ukrainian culture and intellectual tradition and so on. Before I begin with today's episode, I want to also continue imploring everyone to support Ukraine in any way you can. It's more important now than ever. Ukraine is still fighting, remaining strong, and but this kind of attack by the imperialist aggressor, bombarding innocent civilians, committing crimes of war crimes every single day. Kidnapping children, indoctrinating them to hate Ukraine, torturing prisoners of war, destroying civilian infrastructure, targeting civilian objects rather than military objects. So all of these are violations of the international law, and so the aggressor should be punished in accordance with that law. So to start with talking about peace and justice, I want to briefly revisit some of the perspectives that I went over in the last episode, and just provide some additional comments about each of those. So first of all, pacifism. The main thesis of pacifism is that all war is wrong, is morally wrong, and any kind of violence cannot be justified in no way. At least if it's not morally wrong per se, at least it's very extremely suspect, any war. So that's the basic proposition, and regardless of what the cause for the war might be, it's still wrong. And that's very close to absolute pacifism, which does not really provide for any exclusions or specific circumstances that might change the attitude. And more conditional pacifism also takes the stand that all war is morally wrong, but there are certain circumstances in rare situations and defensive situations that justify war. Waging a war. And so, for example, in Ukraine's case, waging a war of defense against the aggressor is a just cause. So Ukrainians are fighting for their freedom, for their independence, for their self-determination, for democracy, for their ability to exist as an independent nation. What is Russia fighting for? For empire, for destruction, for control, for domination. So very different sides to this conflict, and so there you can't equate the two sides and say that they are on equal moral standing. They are not in any possible way. And then the third aspect of pacifism is more pragmatic pacifism. So that's more of an amoral approach to pacifism, saying that war is simply ineffective and counterproductive, even if not exactly morally wrong. So it's rather better to avoid war, but it's not immoral in principle. Okay, so that's it seems a little bit like a cop out, and comes up short as far as I'm concerned. I think conditional pacifism is the way to go if you have to select amongst these three positions. The absolute pacifism goes too far. It's a luxury. Sometimes you have to pick up a weapon and defend yourself. And that's why there exists a right to self-defense in many legal systems. Second perspective I want to delve a little bit more into today is just war theory. It dates back to St. Augustine in the beginning of the first millennium. He set down the main propositions that define this perspective, and then later was picked up by St. Thomas Aquinas and developed further, and then progressively through the centuries it became secularized and integrated into the international law in the 20th century, the Geneva Conventions and so on. And some of the late 20th century political scientists and theorists revived this tradition of just war theory. And two important concepts associated with this theory is jus ad bellum and jus in bello. Jus ad bellum, that's a criteria for starting a war or going to war. There must be just cause, legitimate authority, right intention, last resort, proportionality, reasonable chance of success, and so on. So there's obviously it's a complex matter. There's a lot of considerations, but this is just a basic concept within that tradition. And the second important is jus in bello. That's criteria for how to conduct a war. So, martial law, distinction between combatants and non-combatants, proportionality of the means used to wage a war, no unnecessary suffering. So, for example, in the case of Ukraine, all the destruction, erasure of the whole cities, entire cities in occupied territories through bombardment and through urban warfare. All of that is excessive, and bombarding the innocent civilians in the rest of Ukraine is also excessive, and these are war crimes. They should be recognized as war crimes. So far, only the ICC, the International Criminal Court, only focused on the kidnappings of the children and issued warrants for Putin and for his one of his henchwomen, Maria Lvova Belova. So, but there are other war crimes. It's just they need to be also recognized and ultimately punished. Or at least there should be some consequences for these criminals. So to sum up, the just war theory has its roots in the Christian thought and later was secularized and integrated into the system of international law, as imperfect as it is. In addition to these two perspectives, one focusing on peace, another focusing on justice, justice of starting a war, justice with it in conducting the war, both of these themes are very important for culture. So I'm just thinking in terms of all the literature, anti-war literature that the 20th century is known for after World War I and World War II. I mean, such writers as Hemingway, Orwell come to the mind, Kurt Vonnegut, Norman Mailer, and others, Günter Grass, a very prominent one, and Margaret Atwood, many writers, many voices from various countries from all over the globe wrote against war, having experienced it or just through their empathy, understanding how horrific it can become, and how much destruction and pain and suffering it brings. So that's something that is very important, and I wish I had time or resources to devote more attention to this matter. How war is treated in culture. Maybe that will be something to revisit in the future seasons, depending on what the decisions I make in terms of what themes I would like to cover and where to begin. Another related cultural phenomenon in terms of thinking about war is perspectives related to postmodernism and critical theory. Excuse me. So these perspectives sometimes look at war as biopolitics, as a spectacle, or as discourse. I mentioned briefly these perspectives in the last episode, but I want to just say a few things about this now as well. War as biopolitics, basically controlling who gets to live, who gets to die, and that relates, for example, in Ukraine, bombarding civilian cities, and regimenting life in the occupied territories in specific ways, prohibiting all other religion other than Russian Orthodoxy, all Ukrainian language, education, or any kind of activities in Ukrainian language, and so on. So these are some of the aspects. Spectacle, that relates to just the entire world being able to watch what happens in the war because of the communication, the media, and the instant way of communication now with the internet present. So this was not possible until very recently, and so this current war in Ukraine, in that sense, and other conflicts in the world as well. But this is the biggest one that is unprecedented in that way. The way how communications make it present in our daily lives, no matter how far we are, and turns it into a spectacle almost, as derealizes the horror of that war for many people. It relates to the critique of I'm thinking of a French theorist, Guy Debord, who wrote a book called The Society of Spectacle, so which was a relevant consideration for this theme. And discourse, again, I touched upon this in the last episode, just using warlike belligerent rhetoric in politics, in business, in sports. And competition is part of our life as humans, of course, but glorifying competition and raising it as to some place of reverence is often problematic, and it causes this kind of mental approach, mindset that everything is war, everything is competition, and only it's related to social Darwinism in some ways, with it only the strong survive, whereas in reality Darwinism was about the fittest surviving, which the fittest didn't mean the strongest. It meant it very easily can include those who cooperate with others. They're more fit to survive because they find a way to cooperate rather than to compete and to kill each other, but to work together and to resolve conflicts peacefully. Okay, and then one more important aspect I want to highlight is the technological side of war, related to post-humanist perspectives. Because again, the war in Ukraine is a very good example, because drone warfare has entered a new stage, and this is the whole idea of this perspective, is that technology develops and it changes the way we think about war. It changes the very philosophies of war as the technology changes, and becomes this technology gets used to wage war in new ways. For example, I recently learned that almost every 2 weeks, these drones that are used to wage war in Ukraine, they need to be updated because software needs to be updated, hardware needs to be developed, new hardware to respond to find new solutions to specific challenges of conducting that kind of warfare. AI being used to control the swarms of these drones, almost semi-autonomous, if not fully autonomous. So all of that is new, it's a cutting edge of warfare, one might say, and I'm saying that without glorifying it, it's just the reality of what it is. And just to highlight, besides this drone warfare and AI being used in warfare, and algorithms making decisions in terms of combat. That's introduces new dimension that has never been explored before or practiced. So Ukraine is on the cutting edge in that sense. And then there's cyber warfare, which is also an informational warfare, which is also a very important aspect of any kind of conflict today. The internet makes it very easy to access things in real life, energy grids, any kind of manufacturing facilities, educational facilities, everything. Wherever the computers are used, there's always question of cybersecurity and cyber warfare. So this is a very important aspect of the war to consider. And then the informational propaganda, and so using social media to influence people's opinions and to even use people. There are cases of Russians pretending, as Russian bots interacting with, let's say, Ukrainian teenagers who are not unwitting Ukrainian teenagers, and asking them to do some sabotage in the independent part of Ukraine that is fighting, just to cause chaos and to help them their war efforts. So it's possible. It's very easy. So it has to be. It has to be part of the education from now onward, so that the new generations are aware of this and are prepared to counteract such in case of any conflict anywhere in the world. So, and then the slightly older perspective is the nuclear deterrence theory. It's been around for many decades now, but it's still relevant, but it's more familiar. The mutually assured destruction idea that if nuclear weapons start to be used, it can escalate beyond anyone's control. So it's more of a deterrent, but and Putin uses it a lot to scare everybody, to say that and he will use nuclear weapons, which is mostly bluster. And those experts who understand this emphasize that every time, but a lot of people still get frightened by it, and they and that's what Putin is relying upon, on this psychological warfare. So with that said, so those are some of the aspects I wanted to highlight and speak a little bit more about this time. And I think lastly, I will finish this episode and this season by revisiting the question of why I chose metahumanism, metamodernism, and decolonialism as the three perspectives to define this channel, putting it kind of in a context of my personal experience. And this relates to me saying that I need to take care of my mental health needs presently. So my sense of who I am is not a very simple one. My soul contains several conflicted parts, and is a source of both suffering for me, but also an insight and understanding of how human identities of any kind function, how they are constructed by us and by people around us as well, how they participate in that process, and how they are not rigid or frozen or forever defined. They're relational, and they're open-ended, and they're fluid in a way that we define ourselves, more to greater or lesser extent, depending on which part of which side of identity we mean. So I can say that I relate deeply to mental health struggles, to historical cases of historical oppression, and to intergenerational trauma. All three aspects are very familiar to me and very close to my heart. I also think that all oppression is intertwined and interrelated, no matter what kind it is, whether it is based on class or socioeconomic status, if you will, if you like that term better, whether it's based on culture or ethnicity, whether it's based on race, or whether it's based on some sexual orientation or gender identity, whether it's based on any other dimension, age, gender and sex I already mentioned. So any kind of part of who we are may be oppressed in some ways in certain social structures. And so the point is to recognize all of it, not deny the existence of this oppression or of this dynamic within society, and try to address it, and again, do peace and justice to achieve conflict resolution through peaceful means, and to achieve greater justice as it is possible. I'm very aware that there are other very rigidly dogmatic views on these matters of identity, whether it's religious perspectives or political ideologies, which have different ways of thinking about these things. To me, the closest example is for nationalism, which can be that way, which can state that a certain national identity is very rigid and rigidly defined, and anything that deviates from that rigid definition is incorrect or wrong, or a betrayal of the national identity, which I don't subscribe to that vision at all. But at the same time, it's not as black and white as it might seem on the surface. National identity is a very complex issue, and let's take the case of Ukraine. Again, one of the closest. We can also talk about America, but let's take Ukraine. When a former imperialist power attacks you must defend your way of life and your identity and your values, and that's what Ukraine is doing. National identity is never simple, but it's very important in such times of existential threat. It is just indispensable to be able to defend yourself. So national unity, national is a must in such cases, and it's very similar to what Ukraine was facing in the World War II, in a sense that there were two different totalitarian powers, the Nazis, the Soviets, fighting against each other over control of these Eastern European lands, which Timothy Snyder called bloodlands very aptly. And so Ukrainians had to pick up weapons and defend their land. And that happened. The nationalists were fighting both the Nazis and the Soviets. It's a very complicated history, and there's a lot of misinformation, propaganda spread by all sides. Nazis, the Soviets, the KGB, the nationalists themselves also used various propaganda tactics. It was total chaos at the time, but Ukrainians picked up weapons and tried to defend their right to live in their own land without domination by some other imperial entity. So that's the same struggle that continues today, just in a slightly different shape. But Moscow is still one of those imperial centers that wants to reestablish control of Ukraine, and Ukraine is defending it. Ukrainians defending their right to live freely in their own country and not be attacked by a envious neighbor that wants to reestablish empire. So it's as simple as that. So that goes to the. So there's and here I want to highlight a very important difference between the emancipatory kind of nationalism and the imperialist kind of nationalism, which Ukraine and Russia are two examples that show that very clearly. Emancipatory kind of nationalism struggles for liberation and for self-definition, but the imperialist kind of nationalism wants to oppress, wants to dominate, wants to erase difference. That's what Russia is trying to do right now. And you can all also take America. Putinism and Trumpism, they're very similar in the way they function, and they're two examples of such a imperialistic kind of worldview is dominate and erase difference. So their version of nationalism that they're propagating right now is a virulent kind of nationalism, and must be contrasted to the Ukrainian civic nationalism, which is at the grounding what Ukraine is fighting for these days. There are also other versions of nationalism, and that's something for Ukraine to deal with internally, but there are a lot of propaganda today spread by Moscow and the FSB, which is the successor agency to KGB, they still use the same tactics they used in the past to vilify Ukrainian nationalism of any kind and to portray them as Nazis and portray this war as denazification of Ukraine. And I covered this in my previous video about the propagandist lies. So that distinction between the emancipatory liberationist nationalism and imperialist nationalism is a very important one. And it goes to the core of the problem with colonialism and cultural assimilation. So this kind of violence is perpetrated against the colonized identity and the culture. And it's possible, it can happen anywhere. We can also take America or Canada or any other country that has issues has multicultural societies. And it's problematic when one culture within that society decides that all other variants of that culture are somehow unacceptable or not quite correct or not quite up to par, and they try to establish something to erase those differences and make everybody homogeneous. And that's that kind of thinking is part of today's Trump administration and must be resisted as much as possible. So just to highlight some things that are non-negotiable for me. It's life, freedom, and human rights, among other things, but those are the three I wanted to highlight. Of course, freedom is not absolute because it always carries along the need to be responsible and in exercising that freedom. So freedom of speech is there, but it's not absolute. You can't, for example, hate speech is not included under that protection, and so on. And these are obviously complex issues, but some clarity is necessary. So life, freedom, human rights. Second is Ukraine's survival success is extremely important to me. As far as I'm concerned, Ukraine's future is deeply intertwined and connected to the future of the global security and the future of the world as a whole. That's why there's all these talks about the possibility of World War III, happening if Russia is not stopped in Ukraine. If they're not defeated in Ukraine, this can spread, and it's already Russia is already being emboldened by weak response thus far, weak response to its aggression thus far, and so. We need to be, the world needs to be very decisive in countering this threat. So I will not tire to emphasize this issue. And then lastly, I know I'm not a warrior, so I cannot contribute in that way, but I do know I can do some other things, and that's what I will keep doing going forward. I can keep telling the truth as I know it and in the best way I can. And the third thing that is non-negotiable to me is our common humanity. And there are some that think that, let's say, having personal, ethnic, or national identities somehow is antithetical or opposite or conflicts with cosmopolitanism or humanism. Or metahumanism in the case of this channel, let's say. I don't agree with that. I think that our identities are arranged in concentric circles. First, there's the most personal aspects of who we are, our body, our sexuality, our sense of self, which is not isolated from the world. It's relational, but it is our sense of self. It's important to have that sense, and that connects to mental health struggles for many people. And then there's familial dynamic, family relationships that affect us and our sense of self. Then there's cultural aspects, broader culture of our societies and our communities. And then there's overall humanity, which some would say it's more of an abstract generalization or abstraction. And to some extent that is true. A nation is also an abstraction. A community is in some ways also an abstraction. But there's not just only individuals and nothing else. Their society has a reality of its own. Community has a reality of its own. Nation is a national community of its own. And humanity also has a reality of its own at certain levels. So the international structures, transnational entities, corporations or otherwise, these are all operate at the level of humanity, not at the level of a nation or local communities. And that's what makes today's world so complex. And ultimately, there is the largest circle. It goes beyond humanity to include all life on this planet and the ecosystem of this planet, which is part of, we are also deeply connected to as I see it. And so it's all, it's one, none of these circles contradicts any other. They are all arranged in a certain, you might say hierarchy, but I would say relational matters. So it's not quite so clear cut that one dimension of our identity is somehow lesser or subservient to any other level of our identity. It's just that they interact in complex ways, and they're all important for us simultaneously. But you could arrange them in a sort of hierarchy from the smallest to the largest scope in that way. Just for spatial understanding and for as a metaphor. So to sum up, why these three perspectives, I spoke about them slightly in the beginning when I made the introductory videos for this channel, for the podcast. And I also continue, I plan to, when I return on the next season, what I will do is probably develop a more positive vision for what I mean by these three perspectives, my personal synthesis of these three perspectives, and what exactly I'm offering that is different from what something else that is out there. And what I've achieved, what I've investigated in this during this season will play into that definition. But just to go over it, metahumanism. I selected that perspective because I think it's important to move beyond the rigid boundaries of anthropocentrism, meaning placing human at the center of everything or at the top of a pyramid of everything around humanity, which was more characteristic of classical humanism. But at the same time, avoid those rigid boundaries, but keep the core concerns with autonomy, free will, knowledge, and so on, self-determination and similar notions, reason, science, and so on. So metahumanism questions the very categories of human and animal and machine, and using relational, ecological understandings of living in harmony with our surroundings. So second, metamodernism, I selected that perspective because I think it's important to move beyond the deconstructive kind of perspectives like postmodernism or post-structuralism towards reconstruction of something positive, offering a positive vision of a re-enchanted or re-ensouled world. Sort of this connects to post-criticism, post-nihilism, in my mind. In the future, I will explore that in greater detail for sure. And this approach kind of oscillates between irony and sincerity, between hope and despair, attempting to find new narratives beyond the just postmodern dead ends. Some of them are dead ends. While I value postmodernity and postmodernism as a perspective, I think we need to go beyond that, and that's what the world is doing, and I want to do the same. And the third perspective, decolonialism, I selected it because I first defined it as post-colonialism, but then in the process of doing my investigations, I changed it to decolonialism. It's a slight distinction, which I mentioned in previous episodes, because it's important to move away from colonialist oppression of the past. Or neo-colonial domination that is some states and some nations try to establish as we speak. So not everybody is opposed to that kind of thinking. So that's why I recognize that decolonialism is a very complex matter. It's it's you can't cover and explain what all of it means in one YouTube episode, but it is a very important perspective to me and to everybody in my view. And my approach to it is primarily through the lens of Eastern European history, and especially Ukraine, because other post-colonial situations that continue struggling with decolonization and new forms of economic, cultural, or technological imperialism or colonialism may vary to a certain extent. Not everything is identical, but it is extremely important to recognize that the imperialist nature of the Russian neo-fascist regime, that doesn't detract from any other colonialist situation or post-colonial societies' claims for greater justice. By recognizing Ukraine's post-colonial trauma and experience and its efforts to decolonize, we are expanding the definition of what decolonialism is and what kinds of colonialism have been practiced in the past. And because Moscow dominated the narratives for so long, for several centuries, there's a lot of work to be done to educate people all over the globe about this imperialist history and about their lies and myths, which are inaccurate and distort history in many ways. Trying to deny. That's why Putin today is able to deny Ukraine as a separate nation, because of this prevalence of these myths in all across the globe. And they are using that accumulated cultural capital of these mythologies and propaganda from the past to spread more propaganda today. And that's why it's so important. In this case, it's important to deconstruct all of those myths, and then offer to reconstruct the truthful history of all these nations who were once dominated by the Soviets and other empires prior to that. So ultimately, peace and justice, to bring it back to the main theme of today's final episode, the peace and justice require that we see these colonial structures and practices for what they are. That truth and that revelation disarms them. If the more people know the truth, the more people can counter the propaganda, the better we will be able to resist this kind of encroachment on freedom, democracy, and truth. And that's where I will stand going forward. Nothing will change in that respect. I guess I want to close with suggesting that this first season may be seen as an example of a rhizomatic kind of thinking. The series that I've recorded, several series of episodes, and the different aspects of epistemology, of Ukrainian Baroque humanist synthesis, and Skovroda's philosophy of the heart, then the philosophies of war and political philosophy. So all of those directions, they're in some ways they're interrelated, and they may seem sometimes they may seem not connected very well. It's hard for me to say how other people might perceive them, but to me they do. I see deep connections among all of these themes, and so going forward, I will definitely try to focus and tease out these intersections in a clear way to demonstrate how each of these kind of directions and explorations play into the overall picture that I'm working out for myself and offering to synthesize my own philosophical synthesis. I don't pretend to be a professional philosopher. I said that in the beginning, and it remains true. But I don't believe that that's a requirement for being a philosopher, for philosophizing, because as I mentioned before, each of us is a philosopher to some extent, and so that's how I will proceed in the future as well. And the term I mentioned, rhizomatic kind of thinking, it relates to a French post-structuralist philosopher, Gilles Deleuze, who came up with this concept of rhizome together with Félix Guattari. They wrote a number of different philosophical works. The most famous one probably is the 2-volume set called Capitalism and Schizophrenia, where this concept of rhizome is investigated and explained and presented and described. So it comes from biology, and it refers to an underground vascular network that the mushrooms establish, which help them communicate underground and between create a kind of community, which it's not visible above the ground, but underground it's all interconnected deeply. And it's not a root system, it's different because roots grow vertically, and this rhizome is a horizontal network with many redundant connections that and branchings, and root is more of a vertical kind of structure. So that's rhizome is as opposed to root system. So he contrasted this rhizome to an arborescent kind of thinking that comes from tree-like kind of thinking, or more hierarchical kind of thinking. The vertical hierarchical, where there's a tree which branches out and splits into different branches, but still in a very hierarchical manner. Rhizome doesn't have that central trunk to organize everything, and there's no such hierarchy involved in that metaphor. So this rhizomatic way of thinking is generative and creative, but I also think that arborescent kind of thinking is also necessary to partly organize and complement this more chaotic and nomadic kind of rhizomatic thought. So that is where I will end this episode, with that thought, and that is where I will pick up things when I return for the next season. There's many directions to pursue, and I will just use the time between now and the next season to make some decisions about which directions to investigate first and which to leave for later. As always, I thank you very much for listening, for being with me, and if you can support, keep watching episodes you haven't watched, share, like, comment, and I will focus on developing this channel into something better, something improved, and more interesting, changing some formats, maybe collaborate with some various other creative individuals, so to make it more engaging and more worthwhile of your time. Thank you very much. I just want to end that we shall overcome the forces of oppression, and the struggle continues for as long as each of us draws breath. Keep your faith, do not despair. There is beauty, love, and basic goodness in this world. I believe that very firmly, and all of those things are worth fighting for. And that's at the end, that is what motivates me to do anything in this life, and that's the meaning that I give to my life. Farewell for the time being, and I will see you next time in the next season. Thank you.